Welcome one and all, my name is Alexander and you're listening to Another Realization. So why do people refrain from questioning those whom are proclaimed as an authority figure? All we have to do is trace it all the way back to the source: public schooling. The purported purpose of school is to teach reading, writing, mathematics and other academic fields of thought. But the message that institutions of education actually teach far more effectively than any useful knowledge or skill is the idea that subservience and blind obedience to authority are virtues. Simply consider the environment in which the majority of people spent most of their formative years. Year after year, students live in a world in which they receive approval, praise and reward for being where authority tells them to be, when authority tells them to be there. They receive disapproval, reproach and punishment for being anywhere else. This includes the fact that they are coerced into being in school to begin with. They receive approval, praise and reward for doing what authority tells them to do. They receive disapproval, reproach and punishment for doing anything else, or for failing to do what authority tells them to do. They receive approval, praise and reward for speaking when and how authority tells them to speak, and receive disapproval, reproach and punishment for speaking at any other time, in any other way, or about any subject other than what authority tells them to speak about, or failing to speak when authority tells them to speak. They receive approval, praise and reward for repeating back whatever ideas the authority declares to be true and important, and receive disapproval, reproach and punishment for disagreeing, verbally or on a written test, with the opinions of those claimed to be authority, or for thinking or writing about subjects other than what authority tells them to think or write about. They receive approval, praise and reward for immediately telling authority about any problems or personal conflicts they encounter, and receive disapproval, reproach and punishment for trying to solve any problems or settle any disagreements on their own. They receive approval, praise and reward for complying with whatever rules, however arbitrary, authority decides to impose upon them. They receive disapproval, reproach and punishment for disobeying any such rules. These rules can be about almost anything, including what clothes to wear, what facial expressions to have, how to sit in a chair, what to have on a desk, what direction to face, and what words to use. They receive approval, praise and reward for telling the authority when another student has disobeyed the rules, and receive disapproval, reproach and punishment for failing to do so. The students clearly and immediately see that in their world there are two distinct classes of people: masters, which in this case are the teachers, and subjects, which are the students, and that the rules of proper behavior are drastically different for those two groups. The masters constantly do things that they tell the subjects not to do: boss people around, control others via threats, take property from others, etc. This constant and obvious double standard teaches the subjects that there is a very different standard of morality for the masters than there is for the subjects. The subjects must do whatever the masters tell them to do, and only what the masters tell them to do, while the masters can do pretty much anything they want. Not long ago, the masters would even routinely commit physical assaults, i.e. corporal punishment, against subjects who did not quickly and unquestioningly do as they were told, while telling the subjects that it was completely unacceptable for them to ever use physical force, even in self-defense, especially in self-defense against the masters. Thankfully, the use of regular, overt physical violence by teachers has become uncommon. However, though the force has become less obvious, the basic methods of authoritarian control and punishment remain. Now consider why humans are so quiescent in the presence of moral relativism. When laws get repealed and made up out of nowhere and differ with location and time. At one time it's perfectly fine for you to do this, the next time it's a crime. When, as we've mentioned before, morality is objective and is not dependent upon location, time, or individual whims. Well, in the classroom setting, the authority can change the rules at will, can punish the entire group for what one student does, and can question or search any student, or all students, at any time. The authority is never seen as having any obligation to justify or explain to the students the rules it makes, or anything else it does. And it is of no concern to authority whether a student has a good reason to think that his or her time would be spent being somewhere else, doing something else, or thinking about something else. The grades the student receives, the way he is treated, the signals he is sent, written, verbal, and otherwise, all depend on one factor: his ability and willingness to unquestioningly subvert his own desires, judgments, and decisions to those of authority. If he does that, he is deemed good. If he does not, he is deemed bad. This method of indoctrination was not accidental. Schooling in much of the world was deliberately modelled after the Prussian system of education, which was designed with the express purpose of training people to be obedient tools of the ruling class. Easy to manage and quick to unthinkingly obey, especially for military purposes. As it was explained by Johann Fichte, one of the designers of the Prussian system, the goal of this method was to fashion the student in such a way that he simply cannot will otherwise than what those in authority want him to will. All the time, the system was openly admitted to be a means of psychologically enslaving the general populace to the will of the ruling class. And it continues to accomplish exactly that, all over the world. The reason most people do whatever authority tells them to do, regardless of whether the command is moral or rational, is because that is exactly what they were trained to do. Everything about authoritarian schooling and authoritarian parenting, even the modern version that pretends to be caring and open-minded, continually hammers into the heads of the youngsters the notion that their success, their goodness, their very worth as human beings is measured by how well they obey authority. It is commonly held that unless children are taught to respect and obey authority, they will be like wild animals, stealing, assaulting, and so on. But being obedient in and of itself merely means that instead of the individual using his own judgments, he will defer to the judgments of those who seek and acquire positions of power. Some of the most immoral, corrupt, callous, malicious, dishonest people on earth. Training people to be merely obedient only prevents animalistic behavior if the supposed authority does not itself condone and command theft and assaults, as every government in history has done in the name of taxation and law enforcement. Obviously, teaching obedience does not help civilization if those giving the orders are commanding the very behaviors that harm society, acts of aggression against innocents. The idea that widespread subservience is good for society rests upon the patently false assumption that people in positions of power are morally superior to everyone else. It should be self-evident that having most people disregard their own consciences, instead entrusting politicians to make their choices for them, is not going to make society any safer or more virtuous. Instead, it will simply legitimize the very acts that interfere with peaceful human coexistence. Consider the analogy of a robot, which is programmed to do whatever the owner tells it to do, whether productive or destructive, whether civilized or aggressive. This is akin to a child learning to respect authority. Whether the obedient robot or child ends up being a tool for destruction and oppression depends entirely upon who ends up giving the orders. If, instead, children are taught the principle of self-ownership, the fact that every individual belongs to him or herself, and therefore should not be robbed, threatened, assaulted, or murdered, then the supposed virtue of obedience is completely unnecessary. Consider which one of the following is more likely to lead to a just, peaceful society. Billions of people being taught the basics of how to be moral human beings, the principle of non-aggression, or billions of people being taught merely to obey, in the hopes that the few people who end up in charge will happen to give good orders. If there is any difficulty imagining what would happen in the two scenarios, one need only look to history to see what has happened. Though many imagine teaching obedience to authority to be synonymous with teaching right and wrong, the two are actually opposites. Teaching children to respect the rights of every human being and teaching them that committing acts of aggression is inherently wrong is very important. But teaching them that obedience is a virtue and that respecting authority is a moral imperative will make them grow up to either advocate widespread large-scale aggression or to participate in widespread large-scale aggression. Every statist does one or the other, or both. In fact, teaching obedience dramatically hinders the social and mental development of children. After having grown up in a situation where they were controlled by others, rewarded for obedience and punished for disobedience, if they ever escape that situation, they will have had little or no training and little or no experience or practice in how to think and act from morals and principles, having never exercised their individual judgment and personal responsibility, knowing only how to do as they are told. They will be like trained monkeys that have escaped and have no way to cope with a life of freedom. If their upbringings have been molded mainly by controlling authority figures, people become existentially lost if that control vanishes. In short, people trained to obey authority do not know how to be independent, sovereign, responsible human beings, because all their lives they have been intentionally and specifically trained not to follow their own consciences and not to use their own judgment. So the indoctrinated, when they escape one institutionalized control setting, school, hallucinate another authority to take its place, government. The escape monkeys simply build a new cage and eagerly jump into it because that is all they know and all they have ever known. In a world without the authority myth, on the other hand, children could be taught to be moral instead of merely obedient. They could be taught to respect people instead of respecting the inhuman, violent monster called government. People are more comfortable with whatever they are accustomed to and fear the unknown. People are so attached to whatever is familiar to them that even those who live in very high crime areas or war zones rarely leave the world they know to search for something better. Similarly, it is a well-documented fact that some long-term prisoners develop a fear of being released, and when they are, commit further crimes with the intention of being sent back to prison. Even slaves can exhibit a dread of being freed. This is because the life of a prisoner or a slave, though not likely fulfilling, is predictable, and imagining a new drastically changed life in a strange place among strangers with all of the related uncertainties. How will I eat? Where will I live? What will it be like? Will I be safe? Scares almost everyone, because people crave the comfort of certainty. So it is when most people contemplate human society without a ruling class. The concept is so foreign to everything they have ever known and ever thought about, and everything they were taught is necessary and good, that they hardly know how to begin to imagine it. Even the English language illustrates our fear of living in a society as free equals, because such a state is defined as anarchy, a term that is commonly associated with chaos and destruction, when in fact it has nothing to do with that. Anarchy comes from the Greek prefix an, which means without, and the Greek noun archon, which means ruler or master, especially a master over a slave or subject. People have grown so accustomed to the mental cage which the myth of authority has formed around each of us, that most of us are terrified of the idea of a life without that cage. People are literally scared of their own freedom. Likewise, the newly indoctrinated authoritarians are constantly told in schools that one should not take the law into his own hands, and always run to the teacher to settle disputes. So as they become much older, the people are already trained to call the authorities whenever there is a conflict or other problem, and then meekly do whatever the government's enforcers tell them to do. If there is any dispute between people, the people are told that they should always run to the masters, whether by calling the police or by going to authoritarian courts to settle disagreements. When discussing societal challenges, the well-trained subjects of the state talk in terms such as they should pass a law or they should make a government program. They view their lives as part of a giant centralized master plan, so it logically follows that if they want their lives improved, the solution is to petition the planners to change the plan by lobbying, petitioning, campaigning or protesting. All cul-de-sacs that are designed to keep you in the loop. And this view is so ingrained in the masses that many people literally cannot comprehend the idea of individuals living their lives without being part of anyone else's master plan, which is why people don't act as responsible adults, but they act like infants. So once again, in the education system, you have to receive approval for almost everything you do. What to think, how to speak, when to speak, where to be, when you can go to the bathroom, when you can eat, when you can leave, etc. This is also why people grow up always seeking approval from people other than themselves, because this is all they do since the time they are a small child in the first grade, all the way up to when they're full-grown adults, always needing approval from an authority figure, which in the latter case is the teacher, and as you become much older, this teacher becomes a government, whom you put on that now empty pedestal when you leave the school system. And so people are always looking for answers from the person whom they have placed on that instilled pedestal. And for as long as they don't receive that approval from their beloved parents, the authorities, they will never do or think otherwise, because it is the only world they know thus far, which gives them certainty. But there is one thing that can help people to get out of that state: their imagination. Without the creative mind, one cannot imagine a world outside of the boundaries of the system. Imagine a world without governments, controls, borders, and authorities, which is why the curriculum of modern education is largely focused on the facets of the left brain hemisphere, with the subjects being mainly mathematics, language, chemistry, etc., which are important subjects, but they minify creative skills like music and arts. They largely exclude the right brain intuitive and creative capacities in their curriculum, so that a human being literally can only see things in terms of structures and systems, and the programmed inputs of the aforementioned output. And those structures have turned into shackles, that a human being is not programmed to question the master. Only when the voice of truth can become so widespread that it will gain traction in the minds of people, then imagination can be guided in the individual, so that he or she starts to think for him or herself, as well as by learning how to think, how to know and discern truth from falsehood, by learning the trivium, which is and never will be taught at regular public schools, for the exact reason that it will give the pupil a tool set with which he or she can discern truth from lies and unreality, that this system is so replete with, and that is the last thing they want. When human beings come into the world and explore the things around them, they initially can't make sense of the things they see, without having to discover all of it over again, which is why we now have information. We have a repository of data with which we explain the things around us. The problem is that there isn't much, if any, rapport when it comes to that information you're receiving from all sides. One fraction says this, the other fraction says the other. So, and if you go through that education system where you aren't taught to discern truth from falsehood, you are not being taught how to filter information, but to merely unquestioningly believe the fraction which presents itself as the appointed authority of the day. So you can see why most people will side with the authority. As I've said before, the education system doesn't teach you how to make your own conclusions, how to fill in those blanks. They are telling you what your conclusion should be because they declared it to be so. So in other words, they are filling the blanks for you. They are not teaching you how to fill in the blanks for yourself, because ultimately they do not want you to understand your own sovereignty and your own worth, because you will realize that their authority over you doesn't have any feet to stand on. They want you to conform so that you can become predictable. And the lack of intelligent judgment is also why people eventually become lackadaisical and apathetic, and go on to believe erroneous notions like there is no such thing as truth at all, and everything is based on individual perception, because they don't have a firm grasp on epistemology and on how to discern truth from falsehood. Truth has become largely insignificant to people, and now it's all about feelings. It's about how it makes you feel, which is why people go on to believe the craziest fictions, because their feelings validate and make their fictions real. And here's the thing about feelings. They're so much easier to control than facts, which is why you don't need real climate change. You need only the idea of climate change in order to spur the feelings of your subjects. You don't need a real food scarcity or energy scarcity. You need only the idea of food and energy scarcity. You don't need a real virus. You need only the idea of a, quote, virus. The idea is the most resilient parasite, highly contagious. It is the real virus. And without a proper toolset with which to ascertain the validation of any claim, it becomes almost impossible to eradicate, which is why understanding the hidden knowledge of human psychology specifically is paramount. For you would understand that an idea that is acted upon reflects itself upon its corresponding nature. As above, so below. An idea does not have to be real in order for it to have an effect. If you know my work by now, you will probably understand that the thesis of contagion and immunity is disprovable because it lacks evidence. But the idea can be real somewhere else. Consider the thesis of contagion and immunity as a metaphor. The contagion is alluding to the viruses that are being spread as ideas, that are meant to poison the worldview of the individual. And immunity is the ability to discern reality from fiction. Thus, it has no effect on him or her, but it will have an effect on those who do not possess that ability, or the immunity in the context of the allegory. And with this, I just wanted to show you how the universe works, how everything is reflected. An idea does not have to be real in order for it to have an effect, which shows you just how critical it is to possess intelligent judgment. But the majority is not paying attention, nor are they spending any time to pay attention, because such currencies are being spent on mundane, frivolous means to pointless ends, which is why humanity appears to be devoid of the things they truly need, because the currencies are not being spent correctly. If you are paying attention, ultimately, you are the one who has to learn how to fill in those blanks by learning how to filter through logical fallacies and inconsistencies and to the heart of the truth. You shouldn't just believe anything because it comes from the biased mainstream media or the alternative media, which largely falls prey to a whole lot of other lies and fallacies. There is no side to pick here. You need to side with truth. That's what you need to side with. Is it true? Is it moral? And that's what you need to get to. The ability to exercise intelligent judgment. Because here's the thing. Once we begin to appreciate our own abilities and competencies to think and act effectively for ourselves, we develop self-esteem, which is what humanity is truly largely devoid of right now. And it is why they don't stand up against the injustices that are taking place. If we don't know what's real, we can't resist. So will you take back control over your own judgment and escape your programming and gain self-respect? All you need to do is break down the word. Self, as in yourself. Re, as in again. And spectate, as in to look at. To look at yourself again. Please share this video if you found it helpful, so that it can reach a lot more people. I thank you all for watching, and I'll see you soon.